Hi there guys, my name is Jake Nielsen and I'm going to be going over Peachtree Case B for Dr. Shiroki's Finance 139 class. So question 1 asks us to value TICO's preferred stock outstanding. So in question A, it asks us to calculate the rate of return on its Series A outstanding cumulative preferred stock. And it says it pays a 4.32 dividend payment and currently sells for $48 a share. So to calculate rate of return, we simply just take the dividend payment divided by the value per share, and that gives us a nominal rate of return of 9%. The the effective annual rate of return is a little bit different. It basically takes into account the effects of compounding. So the equation for this one is we're going to take the quarterly dividend payment, or the 4.32 divided by 4. We're going to add that to 1, which will give us the return. We're going to return 1 plus whatever the return is there. And then we're going to multiply that by the number of years that it's compounded at minus 1. And the number of quarters that it's compounded at, because it's quarterly, is 4. So the n minus 1 is going to be 3 in this equation. And that allows us to arrive at an annualized rate of return of 9.31%. We then move on to question B. And question B is asking us to value its Series F outstanding issue. And the only difference here is that the Series F has a mandatory sinking fund provision. And essentially a mandatory sinking fund provision says that the company is going to be obligated to buy back a fixed amount of shares at the end of each year. And it says that they're going to buy back 60,000 shares beginning at the end of 1993. So we're going to treat this just like we would a bond issue that's going to have a fixed maturity. We're going to calculate the cash flow in each of those years, discount those cash flows back to time 0 to calculate the total value of that issue, or in this case, it'd basically be like a bond. Then we take the total value and we divide that by the number of shares outstanding at time 0 to calculate the value per share, the expected value. So the total value of those cash flows, when we add them all up, or the total present value of all those cash flows, is $31,322,068. We then divide that by the number of shares outstanding, which is 300,000, to arrive at a value per share of $104.41. And that one brings us to question 2. And question 2 is asking us to calculate the expected rate of return on TICO's common outstanding stock at the beginning of 1992. And we're assuming a constant dividend growth rate here of 6%. So the model that we're going to choose to use in this one is the Gordon model, or the constant growth model. And that model is simply next year's dividend, or D1, divided by the required rate minus the growth rate. And the required rate is what we're calculating here. So essentially we need to take that equation and we need to shift it around a little bit. And in order to solve for the required rate, we then find that it's equal to next year's dividend payment divided by the current stock price plus the growth rate, which is all given to us in the equation there. So once we plug all those numbers in, we find an expected rate of return of 14.57%. Question B asks us to calculate the expected dividend yield and the expected capital gains yield in 1992. So in order to calculate capital gains yield, we need to find the price in 1993. Using the constant dividend growth model, like I just said in the previous example, we find the stock price in 1993, and then we subtract it from the stock price in 1992, divided by the stock price in 1992 to find the yield there. This expected yield we find is 6%. Then the dividend yield is simply the dividend in the current year divided by the stock price in the current year. And so that is equal to the dividend payment of 1.8 divided by the stock price of 22.26, which shows an expected dividend yield of 8.09%. Question C is more of a concept question here. It asks us what the relationship between dividend yield and capital gains yield is under constant growth assumptions. And under constant growth assumptions, it's essentially assuming just that, it's constant growth. So we can assume that as we have the same growth rate year over year, our expected capital gains and our expected dividend yield is going to remain constant as well. Then part D, we find what the question asks us, what conditions must hold in order for the constant growth model to be assumed. And there's two major assumptions, is that the company is going to continually pay dividends, and they're going to continue to pay dividends at a constant rate. While this works for companies who are maturing in the business cycle and aren't really putting too much research into new products or new R&D or anything else, they want to just keep their shareholders and will keep returning those same dividend payments. This model will work for those kinds of companies that are very mature in the business cycle and have continually paid dividends for a long time. However, most companies are not like this. You're gonna see fluctuating rates of growth and new research and development to deliver new products. And that's what investors are really focused on there. So not many companies are going to follow the dividend growth model here. They're more than likely going to follow a supernormal or unconstant dividend growth model. And then we move to question 3, which asks us to assume just that, is that we're going to have non-constant dividend growth. It says we're going to grow for 6% for 5 years, and then thereafter that we're going to grow at a rate of 7.5%. So that takes us to question A, which asks us to calculate the value of TECO stock at January 1, 1992. And basically what we're going to do, like I said, is we're going to use the supernormal growth model, which asks us to forecast the dividends for the first 5 years using that 6% constant growth. And then we discount each of those cash flows back to the current time using the equation 1 plus the expected rate to the power of the current year that the cash flow is in. So if the cash flow is in year 2, it's going to be 1 plus the expected rate to the second power, and then on. We then add to these discounted cash flows or dividend payments, we have to calculate the value of dividends into perpetuity. And basically we use the constant growth model for that equation in year 5 of the year 5 dividend payment plus the regular growth rate into perpetuity of 7.5% divided by the required rate of return minus the growth rate. That'll give us the stock price in year 5. We then discount that stock price in year 5 to times 0 in order to calculate for the value of the company into perpetuity there. And from this, we find a stock price of $27.55, which is significantly higher than the current market price at the time. Question B essentially asks us to do the same thing. We're just going to calculate the expected stock price at the beginning of 1993 this time. So basically we're just moving the cash flows down. Our cash flow at time 0 is going to happen in 1993 then, instead of in 1992. So we move those cash flows down and we find the stock price appreciates up to $29.36. Question C is the same mimic of question B, except it asks us to calculate the value of the stock in 1994. And we do that by essentially doing the same thing. We're going to shift our cash flows down, and that's going to make our stock price go up to $33.33. Question D asks us to calculate the expected dividend yield and expected capital gains yield in 1992. And we already did this one in a previous question too. We're going to use the same formula. We have to calculate the expected stock price in 1993 minus the expected stock price in 1992 divided by the expected stock price in 1992. We essentially already calculated these both in questions B and A of the same problem. So when we plug those numbers in there, we find a capital gains yield of 6.58%. And then our dividend yield is simply the dividend for 1992 divided by the stock price in 1992, which gives us a dividend yield of 6.53%. We then add those two numbers together to get a total return of 13.1%. Question E is a little bit of a concept question. It asks us to calculate the value of TECO stock, assuming that dividends remain constant at 1.8 for the next 5 years and then grow at 6% into perpetuity. Basically, we're assuming a 0% growth rate for those first 5 years, so we would hope that the stock would be significantly lower if we're assuming 0% growth. And when we plug it in, we do find that the stock price is significantly lower. It lowers it down to $19.76 because those present values become worth less than they would if they were growing at a fixed rate. Then we move on to question F, and for question F, it gives us a fixed stock price and then it asks us to calculate the expected return. And for supernormal growth, this is a little bit more difficult because of issues with compounding. So I used what-if analysis on Excel in order to calculate this growth rate. I used fixed cell references to input the growth rates from the previous problem or from the beginning of the problem, and then I input different values for the required rate to find out how it would change the stock price. I was able to arrive at a required rate of 15.68% in order to get the stock price down to $22.26. Question G asks us to figure out if the 6% growth rate that's assumed is reasonable into perpetuity. And basically, in order to compare the 6% growth rate, we have to look at historical trends in growth rates of dividends over the time period too. So I went back into the charts, and you can find the dividends for 1989 through 1993. I then calculated the difference in these dividend payments to find the growth rate. And for 1990, we found a growth rate of 7%. For 1991, we found a growth rate of 6.67%, and for 1992, 6.25%. For 1993, 11.76%. Thus, we can see that the growth rate has been significantly above 6% or just above 6% for the last several years. So we can assume that the 6% growth rate is actually probably pretty sustainable. And that brings us to question H here, which is a little bit different. It asks us to use ROE and the retention ratio to compare the long-run sustainable growth rate of 7.5% that's given in the beginning of the question, and see if this 7.5% is going to be sustainable. Essentially, in order to calculate this, we're going to take the ROE times the retention ratio in order to calculate the growth rate. And when we do this, we find that the expected growth rate is actually 5.35%, which is significantly lower than the 7.5% in the problem. Thus, we can assume that the 7.5% growth rate probably isn't sustainable into perpetuity or forever. Thus, we should probably use an estimate that's closer to 5% in order to assume this. And that wraps up my presentation for Peachtree Case B.